Hello, and welcome back to Marketplace Tech's limited series, Decoding Democracy. I'm your host, Kimberly Adams. Well, election season is finally and officially over, with just about all the votes having been counted and all the closest congressional races done. And Donald Trump is preparing to take the White House in January, with Republicans preparing to take the majority in both the House and the Senate. Now, some people feel really good about this outcome, while others feel really badly. And this week, many people from both sides of the spectrum are going to sit down together at the table for Thanksgiving dinner. Now, in anticipation of some potentially awkward conversations with friends and family this holiday season, we've invited Whitney Phillips onto the show to talk about how to navigate these moments. Whitney is an assistant professor of digital platforms and ethics at the University of Oregon. Whitney, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much.
Now, we're going to get to those conversations in a moment. But first, in the weeks since the election, there have been murmurs of misinformation online, with some people, both supporters of winning and losing candidates, talking about inconsistencies in the vote count. What makes these narratives so appealing?
One of the main reasons that people end up believing conspiracy theories or seeking out conspiratorial content is when an outcome doesn't match up with the expectations for that. And so Harris supporters in particular, given the sort of idea that it was going to potentially be a coin toss, but that it would be very close, and then it ended up not being, it wasn't a landslide, but Trump won decisively and quickly. That didn't compute with what the expectations were. And so people who were spending a lot of their time online trying to find answers were either seeking out some sort of confirmation or explanation for this apparent discrepancy, or they were just spending a lot of time online trying to just make sense of it generally, and then we're being fed things. So anytime there's confusion about an outcome or it doesn't line up with what the expected outcome would be, you can expect to see these kinds of narratives swirling, particularly for people who are spending a lot of their time online.
So let's talk about the people who are going to be spending a lot of time with family members, perhaps on the opposite side of the political spectrum this holiday. What should we do if a friend or a family member brings up something that sounds like misinformation to us?
Perhaps counterintuitively, one of the best and most important ways to respond is to check in on your friend or family member and see how they are doing. And that again might not immediately seem obvious, but one of the consequences of being very stressed out because of circumstances politically or just interpersonally is that people tend to become more reactive in their thinking. And they're often, I see this in my students all the time, I see it in my life very often, people get stressed out, and so they go to the internet to try to make sense of things. That stresses them out more, and then they become even more agitated and more kind of cognitively, maybe not incapable, but with a lot more challenge in processing information. And so one of the best things to do when someone is expressing something that's false is to sort of encourage them, maybe not directly, but just try to get people to take a breath, because you can't really think about the things that you are saying or seeing if you are very, very stressed out. There's a strong relationship between stress and overwhelm, and then sort of diminished ability to think critically or to take perspective about an issue. And so if a friend is saying something false, it probably means that they're stressed out, which is then having all kinds of impacts on the kind of information they're seeking out and what they're doing with that information. And once someone is able to take a breath or to go for a walk or whatever it is that might help them downregulate, then it might be easier to have a less heated and intense conversation about something. And having that conversation, if you hear your friend or family member saying something false, it's not enough to just say, you're saying false things. Getting to the root of why they believe it. What are the underlying stories? Because people don't just randomly believe things that are false. Oftentimes those things line up with things that they believe to be true about the world, institutions that they maybe don't trust, public figures that they maybe don't trust. And so getting to not just the facts of the case, but also the underlying reason why someone might be inclined to disbelieve fact checks of a story So checking in and also trying to get to the underlying story that's animating a person's belief, that's a way to keep the temperature down and also to try to address the root of the belief and not just the false claim itself.
What are some good questions to kind of open that conversation? Because obviously you don't want to tell somebody who's upset to calm down,
Mm-mm.
but what would you say?
I would just ask them. I mean, we can tell when people in our field of vision are stressed out. Rather than telling someone to calm down, you might say, I feel like going for a walk. Do you want to go walk with me? Or let's go pet the dog, or somehow redirect the conversation to a more embodied experience. Stress lives in our body, and dealing with stress, sometimes talking can help, and it often does help, but sometimes moving helps too. Refocusing. And once somebody is able to refocus, then you can ask questions like, where did you see this information? Or, your other friends on TikTok, are they seeing the same thing? Or just trying to open up a conversation that isn't specifically about the thing that it's about, but just getting somebody talking, getting somebody listening, and getting somebody back into their body is a way to at least prevent the conversation from becoming immediately reactive and ultimately pointless. Because if someone is very stressed out, not in their body, and feeling defensive about something that you're saying, the conversation is just not going to go very well. So it's not a perfect science. You sort of have to gauge, who is this person? What is their relationship to you? What do you know about them? And then kind of use that information to just try to bring the temperature down just a little bit, which you're not going to get to if you just immediately start jumping onto the fact check train.
There's something called narrative persuasion theory that can sometimes be helpful in these kinds of situations. Can you explain what it is and how it works?
Yeah, narrative persuasion theory is it's it's an area of study where scholars test empirically the ability of stories to change minds, change behavior, influence our actions and reactions and thoughts about the world. And you have scholars like Melanie Green who do really, really interesting work where they gauge the effectiveness of stories in smoking cessation efforts or other kinds of health interventions. And what these scholars find is that stories, which can take a number of different forms, but that stories play a different role in cognitive processing than just yelling facts at people. When you yell a fact at someone, it's not necessarily or even very likely to be convincing to someone who strongly believes a particular bit of information is true, either because it's being reinforced in a lot of the media they're engaging with, or because it lines up with something connected to their identity, or it just feels true. In those moments, fact checks might not be helpful in the way that we assume, but stories have a way, and again, various forms that they can take, fictional stories, first-person narratives, case studies, that it can get someone thinking in a different way about an issue. And so if someone were to come to me believing a falsehood about the 2024 election, what I might do in response, rather than immediately fact checking them, is sort of pulling from the insights of narrative persuasion theory, tell a story about the information I encountered, or the kinds of sources that I've engaged with, or what my students are seeing in the election class I'm teaching, which is a way of kind of getting into the heart of the discussion rather than just skating along the surface, which is the fact itself or the claim itself. And again, that might seem counterintuitive. Shouldn't we go straight for the facts? But the facts aren't always why people believe things or disbelieve things. And so stories are a way to kind of get to the heart of the matter in a different way, and are more likely to minimize the reactive defensiveness that someone might feel, and therefore makes them a little bit more open, or has the possibility of making them a little bit more open to widening their narrative aperture, thinking about other kinds of things or other kinds of experiences that maybe they haven't considered yet.
As we navigate the next few years in this increasingly polarized political environment, how should we think about communicating with others of differing beliefs, especially online, not just in person?
It's so important to remember how profoundly connected our well-being is with how we communicate. the more stressed out we are, the more overwhelmed, the less cognitive ability we have to do things like take perspective or approach someone else with empathy or soothe our fears or distinguish true threats from imagined threats. That the more stressed out we are, the harder it is to do that. And so if we find ourselves constantly reactive, constantly defensive, we're not going to be in the headspace to be able to have the kinds of difficult, maybe awkward conversations that require some patience and also require a lot of perspective. Stress takes away our perspective. So we've got to think about not just how do we have conversations with other people, how do we take care of ourselves so that we are better able to identify when we are moving into a very stressed reactive state and either remove ourselves from the conversation because it's not going to go well, or find ways to bring our own energy down. Only when we approach an issue with a kind of calm, balanced nervous system are we going to be able to do the things we need to do to listen, to communicate effectively, and to have the kinds of hard discussions that are absolutely necessary within a deliberative democracy.
Well, thank you so much, Whitney Phillips.
Thank you.
Whitney Phillips is a media studies professor at the University of Oregon. Thank you all for watching this final episode of Decoding Democracy. We've covered a lot over the past 18 episodes, including plenty of ideas, tips, and tricks and facts that are still relevant in the post-election period. So take a look back through our archives and think about sharing this video or maybe a previous episode with a friend, a family member, or a colleague to help prepare for this next chapter in our democracy. Rosie Hughes produced this episode. I'm Kimberly Adams.